One and all, one and all. If you're watching this today, it means that it's Zimbabwean Independence Day today. 30, no, 46 years in the game. 1980, Zimbabwe got its independence April 18th, and I've timed this that so such that we drop this video right on Independence Day. Excited. It's one of the calendar days for me. You know what I mean? There's 5 or 6 days that are sacred to me, and April 18th is one of those days. I'm sure in time we'll catch on to the other ones. Or if you've already caught on to them, you can let me know in the comment section too. What other days I personally celebrate beyond my birthday and this day as well. So today I'm doing a video. Now, full disclosure. Full disclosure. Oh, by the way, it's yours truly, Shingima Vima. I'm back. I'm excited to be talking to you today. This video, full disclosure, is a version of a video I've done before, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Some of you guys will remember. Long-time viewers will remember. But I do want to say this, that I was playing a portion of this video for a class I'm teaching right now at the beginning of the semester. And I just wasn't a big fan of how I had sounded back then. And to my credit, up until then, the videos that I've been making were my video lectures for my classes, for my freshman college classes. So this was the first time I was stepping out of doing that type of content into doing like other longer form essay content. And I was just a little too wordy, something that you're probably like accusing me of being right now. And the video had come out way too bloated in ways that I ended up having to do 2 parts of it, which I don't think is necessary at all. And we're going to try see if I can do it in one go this time around. Without further ado, the video I'm talking about today is in honor of Zimbabwean Independence Day. I'll be talking about 5 guests from the Pan-African community who showed up to the festivities in Harare back in 1980. But as I was explaining just now, or maybe I didn't explain why this matters at all, Zimbabwe, so 1960, let's start with that. 1960 is largely regarded as the year of Africa. It is a year that 17 African countries got their independence, including 13 French colonies, but also places like Nigeria got their independence that year. So it's called the Year of Africa. A missile went out that declared that 1960, the Year of Africa, right? But even as it looked hopeful that Africa was entering this post-World War II era with the advent of independence, beginning in the 50s, then in 1960 it hits a crescendo with 17 countries getting their independence in one fell swoop. It looked like Africa was on its path to independence. However, the colonies in Southern Africa held on a little bit longer. The colonies in Southern Africa, the settler colonies predominantly. So when we talk about that, we mean like Portugal still had its colonies, Angola, Mozambique, up until the 1970s. Zimbabwe remained a colony up until 1980. I've spoken a lot about the back and forth with Zimbabwe, with the unilateral declaration of independence in 1965. So I'll make sure to include a link that talks about those transitions as well in the comments section, in the description box. But Zimbabwe was another one, Namibia as well, sort of as a pseudo province of South Africa. What I'm saying here is, if 1960 was the year of Africa, Southern Africa was holding on a little bit longer, right? And Zimbabwe's independence in 1980 marked the last real sort of independence before the fight for the end of colonialism moved entirely into the fight against apartheid in South Africa, which would fall in 1994. So in 1980, the reason I'm emphasizing this is Zimbabwe was sort of this last bastion of colonialism in Africa, and a lot of nations, a lot of members of the Pan-African community came out strong in celebration. They came out strongly in support of the independence of Zimbabwe. Then in 1980 as well, they came out in full force to celebrate the advent of independence. And today we are focusing on a few of those figures that did that. So The first person I'm talking about is a darling of mine, one of my favorite writers of the 20th century, and that's a writer named Walter Rodney. Walter Anthony Rodney was born in Georgetown, Guyana, on March 23, 1942, then known as British Guyana. He grew up in the country's anti-colonial movement. His father, right, was a member of the Marxist-oriented People's Progressive Party, PPP, which led the struggle for freedom from British rule. So as he was immersed into politics, Rodney himself, his interest in the struggles of the working class began at a young age and continued with his involvement in debate and study groups throughout his student years. He developed into an intellectual and scholar and is recognized as one of the Caribbean's most brilliant minds. And I'll take it as beyond that and say just the Pan-African community's brilliant minds. Rodney's academic record is filled with awards, open scholarships, honors. He attended Queen's College, which is the premier boys' high school in Guyana, and in 1906 graduated first in his class, winning an open scholarship to the University of West Indies. So this is a big deal. He pursued his undergraduate studies at UWI Mona campus in Jamaica. So UWI has multiple campuses. One of the bigger ones is in Jamaica, where he graduated with first class honors BA in history in 1963. He then attended the prestigious School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London University. Amazing college. One of my friends, actually, shout out to Dr. Bernie Moore if you're watching this, had a stint over there. He told me amazing stories. Anyway, Rodney would graduate with his PhD with honors in African history at 24 years old on the same day that he welcomed his firstborn son, Shaka. What a beautiful day. Rodney's thesis, A History of the Upper Guinea Coast, was published by Oxford University Press in 1970. In July 1966, Rodney left London for his first teaching post at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania during the period of radical political and agrarian reform led by Julius Nyerere, or what we call the Ujamaa years, right? Tanzania had just gotten its independence in the early 1960s from the British. And like many other countries that had been under the heavy hand of colonialism, which many governments or many nationalist movements began to associate with capitalism, a lot of folks experimented with leftist ideologies, whether it was Marxism in general, or brands of socialism, or this particular brand was known as Ujamaa and was spearheaded by Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. Tanzania at the time was the headquarters of the Organization of African Unity's Liberation Committee. Became the base for many exile liberation movements of Southern Africa. Among these organizations were the ANC, South Africa, right? Frelimo in Mozambique, then MPLA out of Angola, indeed, and Zimbabwe had a presence there as well. In this atmosphere, Rodney developed his Pan-African perspectives along Marxist lines and sided with Southern Africa's left-wing activists. In 1968, while a professor at UWI, which he had gone on to be after he graduated, Walter Rodney not only taught but also spoke to groups in the depressed areas of Kingston and the rural areas. Unlike his counterparts, Rodney, there were other scholars who were already doing this sort of work. But unlike them, Rodney involved the working class. He wasn't just a talented 10th kind of guy, including the Rastafarians, right, in this dialogue, Marasta. His articles, speeches, and lectures to these groups were published as Groundings with My Brothers and became central to the Caribbean Black Power movement. Rodney's activities garnered the Jamaican government's ire, and after attending the 1968 Black Writers' Conference in Montreal, Canada, he was banned from re-entering the country. Sparking widespread student and civil unrest at the University of West Indies, right, UWI, its surrounding communities, and in Kingston, Jamaica. The protests were referred to as the Rodney Riots, and this ban marked a watershed in Jamaica's political development. The scale of mass action in support of Rodney surprised the regime. The protests were all over the place too, not just throughout the Caribbean, but Tanzania, Canada, and London. Rodney's reputation as a scholar activist with a relevant critique of the Jamaican and Caribbean post-colonial elites, something following the tradition of a Frantz Fanon, was firmly established. This is when he had gone to Dar es Salaam. But when he was done with his appointment in Tanzania in the summer of 1974, he was invited to spend time at the Institute of the Black World, IBW, the phenomenal organization founded by Vincent Harding, Robert Hill, and Bill Strickland in Atlanta, USA. In 1974, Walter returned to Guyana to take up the appointment as Professor of African History at the University of Guyana. But the government, right, of Forbes Burnham, rescinded the appointment. Burnham saw the young scholar activist as a potential threat and tried to keep him out of Guyana. Remember, this is where he's from. Rodney remained in Guyana ultimately, but he wasn't teaching anymore, and joined the newly formed political group, the Working People's Alliance, WPA, a political organization that offered a non-racial approach to Guyanese politics. As the WPA gained popularity and momentum, right, the government began a campaign of harassment, including police raids, house searches, beatings, and state-sanctioned killings. On July 7, 1979, Rodney, together with 7 WPA members, were arrested following the destruction of 2 government offices. So these guys were really about this life. Rodney and 4 others, known as the Referendum 5, faced trump-up charges of arson, but without proof and intense scrutiny from international supporters. The government was forced to drop these charges. The persecution and violence against the opposition forces then intensified. Father Darky, a priest and photographer for the Catholic Standard newspaper and supporter of Rodney, was stabbed to death by members of the House of Israel, led by American-born Rabbi Washington. 2 WPA members, Ohene Konhama and Edward Dublin, were killed by the police. The government denied Rodney and others permission to travel abroad. Despite this, Rodney continued his academic writings, political work, and he left Guyana clandestinely to attend Zimbabwe's independence celebration as a guest of Robert Mugabe himself in April of 1980. Though Rodney lived with constant police harassment and frequent threats against his life, he nonetheless managed to complete 4 books in his last year of his life: an academic work, A History of the Guyanese Working People, 1881 to 1905, A Political Call to Action, People's Power, No Dictator, and 2 children's books, Kofi Badu Out of Africa and Lakshmi Out of India. So here in Guyana, right, it's talking about Kofi Badu out of Africa and Lakshmi out of India. What is he paying homage to? The multiple ethnic groups that now form the Caribbean, right? A lot of times, if you're looking at it from a Pan-African angle, then the West Indies is very much a black space, but with some presence of the colonial powers. But there's still remnants of the indigenous population that was there, even though a lot of these were exterminated during the era of slavery and colonization. But also huge Indian populations from the Indian subcontinent brought in, right? And this is something that Rodney is paying homage to. On Friday, June 13, 1980, while driving his car with Rodney, was assassinated by a bomb in Georgetown, Guyana. He was 38 years old. Donald Rodney, his brother, survived to become the only living witness of the state-sponsored assassination. In the 40 years since the assassination, Rodney's wife, Patricia, and their children have pursued justice. This is a report that came out of the U.S., Washington, D.C., June 13, 2020, so 40 years to the date since his assassination. And I read here from the U.S. report that came out, right? The U.S. Embassy in Guyana in 1980 had strong evidence to believe that the death of internationally known historian and activist Walter Rodney in the capital of Georgetown was a political assassination, according to the declassified documents obtained and posted today for the first time by the National Security Archive at the George Washington University. In 2014, the president of Guyana established a commission to investigate the death. It was terminated early after a new government came to power, but the commission's report nevertheless concluded that state authorities had been behind the operation. Who was responsible for his death quickly evolved into two arguments. The government claimed Rodney caused his own death by accidentally switching on an illegally obtained bomb concealed in a walkie-talkie, while the WPA claimed a bomb had been hidden in a walkie-talkie given to Rodney and his brother Donald by an undercover government agent whose name is now known. The WPA alleged the bomb was then remotely detonated by that agent, who immediately left the country on a flight arranged by the government. So that's what had happened in the moment, but in 2020, the U.S. Embassy in Guyana, the National Security Archive, pun not intended, exploded the whole story and said, no, actually, it had been killed by the government. So that's interesting, right? That this Pan-Africanist figure had been banned out of Jamaica in what led to the Rodney riots. He'd been forbidden from teaching at the University of Guyana, and he ends up getting killed by his government. To protect what? Right? Cold War era capital, right? So this, again, shows some of the complications of the Pan-African movement, right? Who are these guys who are killing Walter Rodney, and for whom are they killing him, right? And justice was served on June 10, 2021, when the government of Guyana accepted the report of the Commission of Inquiry, which at this point they couldn't really run away because even the US is saying we have proved that this was done, right? Concluding that Dr. Walter Anthony Rodney was assassinated by the agents of the state with the full knowledge of the then president of Guyana, Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. So that's the story of Walter Rodney, a true hero of the Pan-African space. All right. Next up, remember we are talking about, is not really a member of the Pan-African community at all, but is was somebody who the Pan-African community engaged quite prominently through the activism, through such activities as Black internationalism, right, or Third World alliances, right. This is very important, and the person I'm talking about here was India's first female prime minister, second ever prime minister, right? The iconic Indira Gandhi, who I'll talk about shortly. Again, the Indian National Congress is already of some Pan-African significance because in Southern Africa, the Indians there in South Africa had found the Natal Indian Congress, which has its own issues with the ANC and so forth, but even the ANC itself is formed in the vein and even with the moderate politics by westernized indigenous intellectuals, similar to the ANC. So before Indira existed, these connections already were a thing, even though if they are more nuanced than that. But we can have that conversation another day. So Indira Gandhi was born, and famously as well, all right, another connection is that Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister of India, was somebody who vocally condemned the occupation of Ethiopia in the 1930s, which was again another show of force for Third World solidarity before the concept of the Third World was even fully developed, right? Which just shows that there was among members of the Indian National Congress and the anti-colonial movement there, the connections with other parts of the colonized world were very much palpable. So let's talk about Indira. Indira Gandhi was the first female prime minister of India, serving for 3 consecutive terms, beginning in 1966 to 1977, at which point she is kicked out for a bit. Then she comes back in 1980 until 1984. Indira Nehru, that's a last name, that's a maiden name, was the only child of Jawaharlal Nehru, who I've already spoken about, who was the first prime minister of India, of an independent India. So Indira is the second one. She succeeds her father, right? Her grandfather Motilal Nehru was one of the pioneers of the movement itself and was very close to Mahatma Gandhi. Now Indira Gandhi is not actually related to Mahatma Gandhi, not in that direct way. She got married to a Gandhi, Feroz, I believe late 1940s, but he died in 1960, or at least But anyway, she was a Gandhi by marriage, but not even directly in the Mahatma bloodline. But then she goes on to be but her father, let's talk a little bit about her father. Her father is the guy who had condemned the occupation of Ethiopia in 1930, in the 1930s. In 1955, right now, as sort of the democratic socialist leaning president or prime minister of India, he had also been a huge movement in a huge figure in establishing the Afro-Asian movement in 1995. Famously, the groups of the colonized world met at what is known as the Bandung Conference in 1955 in Indonesia. He's one of the leaders of that. In 1961, he would go on to this conference in 1955 was an important step towards the eventual creation of the non-aligned movement, right? Or NAM. What is the non-aligned movement? Well, during the Cold War, the side that went with the US, right, as mostly represented by NATO membership, was one group. The side that went with the Soviet Union, more the leftist side, largely spoken about through the Warsaw Pact, those could be regarded as the first and the second world. All the countries that were choosing not to take a side in that conflict, even if ideologically there were similarities, became known as the non-aligned movement. And this also is why countries that usually fall into that the last countries to be to get their independence and thus to be less economically developed as a result of the path they've traveled. Those are usually the poorer nations. That's why people think of that as being the third world, but that's not actually what the third world means. The third world initially just meant countries that had not that were not in the first world, with the US on the side of the Cold War, the second world with the Soviets on the side of the Cold War. The non-aligned nations were usually what people thought of when they thought about the third world. But it just became synonymous with the countries that were emerging from colonialism and generally poorer. So people now think third world means poorer countries, but that's not what it actually meant initially. But anyway, the non-aligned movement, founded in 1961, of which India was a key member, supported freedom movements in Africa, including Zimbabwe's, by recognizing their liberation struggles and accepting their provisional governments. This gave legitimacy to new states that were leaving behind colonial rule and entering world politics. Gandhi, right? This was all before her time. This is just as she was getting prepped up to take over in the 60s. She attended for 1 year each Visva Bharati University in West Bengal, and then also the University of Oxford in England. And then she joined the Congress Party, right? The party in 1938. And in 1942, she married Feroz Gandhi, who died in 1960. But they had two kids, Sanjay and Rajiv. Gandhi strongly supported East Pakistan in its secessionist conflict with Pakistan in late 1971. So if you know anything about the split of when India got its independence, because Pakistan had been a part of that, the heavily Muslim nations became Pakistan, but there was two sides, right? The Pakistan right now was West Pakistan, is the big part. Then there was East Pakistan, which is modern day Bangladesh. But the Bangladeshi people felt they were not equally represented, so they were pushing for further independence to just do their own thing. And India's armed forces achieved a swift and decisive victory over Pakistan that led to the creation of Bangladesh. And she became, obviously, the first government leader to recognize the new country. This is where a story gets fascinating. Indira comes in, very socialist leaning. She nationalizes the banks. She provides lots of loans for the peasants, built low-cost housing, all these things. But in June 1975, the Allahabad High Court found Indira Gandhi guilty of electoral malpractice during the 1971 election. Specifically, she was accused of using government machinery for her campaign. This court then invalidated a 1971 election victory and barred her. So this is happening in 1975, remember, from holding elected office for 6 years. Rather than resign, Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency on June 25, 1975, citing threats to national security and order. This allowed her to rule by decree, suspend civil liberties, and postpone elections. Hey, girls can do that too. And this emergency lasted until March 1977, when she finally lifted the emergency and called for elections. At which point, she loses the election. She goes on to lose the election. And then, as a result, after losing the election, she is briefly imprisoned from October 1977 to 1978 on charges of official corruption. Then in early 1978, sort of prepping for a comeback, Gandhi and her supporters completed the split from the Congress Party by forming the Congress I Party, I signifying Indira, which some of my Zimbabwean viewers who may recognize as being familiar, because remember when MDC was splitting up at MDC-T, Trangira, MDC, this other letter, indeed. So when new election, however, even though she was arrested for the time, she came back. The other thing that she had also been engaged in was a forced sterilization program, which had made her very unpopular. But still, she retained so much popularity from the peasants that in 1980, Gandhi and Congress I were swept back into power in a landslide victory. Indira Gandhi first met Mugabe during the Zimbabwean Independence Day celebrations, along with former External Affairs Minister K. Natwa Singh. Singh talked about the meeting with Mugabe in his book, Walking with Lions, also throwing some light on the relationship between Gandhi and Mugabe. Singh recounted the time when he first contacted Mugabe to inform him of Gandhi's plans to join the independence celebration. So she was coming from India. Before leaving, I asked Mugabe, "Sir, could I tell Mrs. Gandhi how much you are looking forward to greeting her in an independent Zimbabwe?" Of course, do tell her. I admire her and her great father," he replied. In 1984, she hosted the non-aligned movement in Delhi. So this is after she had already been over there. And in 1986, I only mentioned this to say now she had also taken the role that her father had played. She was hosting the meetings. And in 1986, this is another thing that ties them together. Mugabe succeeded India, right, as the chair. Right? 3 decades after this meeting, Gandhi, her family, and the Congress were highly praised by many top African leaders at the 2015 India-Africa Summit in New Delhi, including Robert Mugabe. 93-year-old Mugabe at the time, 2015, termed the Indian National Congress a great party as he recalled African ties with Gandhi and the Congress. So what happened to Gandhi? Indira Gandhi. During the early 1980s, Indira Gandhi was faced with threats to the political integrity of India. Several states sought a larger measure of independence from the central government, and Sikh separatists in Punjab state used violence to assert their demands for an autonomous state. In 1982, a large number of Sikhs, led by Sant Janel Singh Bhindranwale, occupied and fortified the Golden Temple complex. The Sikh religions, their holiest, that's their Mecca, that's their Jerusalem, that's their Vatican. Tensions between the government and the Sikhs escalated, and in June 1984, Gandhi ordered, think about this has been months, right? Ordered the Indian army to attack the holiest shrine of the Sikhs and oust the separatists from the complex. Some buildings in the shrine were badly damaged in the fighting, and at least 456, right, were killed. Sikh estimates of the death toll are considerably higher. 5 months later, Gandhi was killed in a garden in a barrage of bullets fired by 2 of her own Sikh bodyguards in revenge for the attack in Amritsar. This surprises me, even though she had obviously very much violated the holiest shrine. I also don't understand why she kept Sikh bodyguards, because a religion in that way is an ideological leaning. So the Sikh bodyguards would obviously be very much outraged by the killing of 450 of their kin and the attack of their holiest of holy buildings. So anyway, so she was assassinated in 1984, and succeeded by a son, Rajiv, who himself was also assassinated in 1989. All right. Next up, I am now talking about Andrew Young. Andrew Young um, was an American politician, civil rights leader, and clergyman who served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1973 to 1977, and later on, between 1982 and 1990, was the mayor of Atlanta. Young attended segregated Southern schools and later entered Howard University, right, the mecca of HBCUs, as a pre-med student. But he turned to ministry and graduated in 1955 from Hartford Theological Seminary in Connecticut with a divinity degree. A pastor at several black churches in the South, Young became active in the civil rights movement, especially in voter registration drives. His work brought him in contact with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Young joined with King in leading the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Young, a Democrat, ran again in 1972 and won. He was re-elected in 1974 and 1976. In the House, he opposed cuts in funds for social programs while trying to block additional funding for the war in Vietnam. Right, so this is in the 70s. So these are the Ford years, right? These are the post-Nixon years. And the House has taken a swing to the right. So gone are the days of LBJ and them's Great Society. So cutting in funds to social programs are all the raging. But he's one of the people who oppose that. He was an early supporter of Jimmy Carter, and after Carter's victory in the 1976 presidential election, Young was made the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in 1977. In fact, Zimbabwean independence was something he specifically highlighted as a goal at his confirmation. His apparent sympathy with the Third World made him very controversial, and he was finally forced to resign in 1979 after it became known that he had met with a representative of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Talking later, so full disclosure, Andrew Young did not actually make it there is no proof. Anyway, I couldn't find conclusive proof that he was there. But I just thought his role in putting this on the radar of Carter right in the lead up to Zimbabwean independence, and the fact that he would invite Mugabe later after independence to come to Atlanta and so forth was worth talking about. But the other guy, American, we'll talk about was there in 1980. But in any case, back to Young. In a 2013 interview with the Herald, prominent Zimbabwean newspaper, Young said, "I first met Robert Mugabe at this party. Long before this, right, his party in the 70s. 1977. It's in 1977. So he goes, I first met Robert Mugabe at the party. Long before this, a visiting Catholic Jesuit priest whom I met in the US had wanted me to meet one of his brilliant students by the name of Robert Mugabe. From then onwards, I became eager to meet him. So at the party, I saw this beautiful woman standing alone in a corner, all alone, and that's who I went up to talk to. I said, 'Excuse me, Mom, I'm Andrew Young.' And she said, 'I'm Sally Mugabe.' And I said, 'You're related to that awful terrorist, Robert Mugabe, are you?' Very surprising that you would have been calling him that at this party, and especially talking about that to somebody who's potentially his kin, unless he was being tongue-in-cheek. And she said, 'He is my husband.' And just then, Mugabe had seen me, and he leaned over and said, 'Young man, in Africa, before we speak to the wives, we meet their husbands first.' And we laughed. So that must have been a tongue-in-cheek thing about him being a terrorist. And we became good friends. We met and we liked each other. That was my first encounter with him. Very few people by then were enlightened about the struggles in Southern Africa, in particular the struggles for independence in Southwest Africa, now Namibia, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and South Africa itself. Most people in the Congress were in the dark. The CIA was involved in the assassination in Chile and all over the world. This is Young talking. I started talking to Carter about human rights and democracy. At the time, I said my friend, MLK, gave his life for certain principles in life. What a flex. I told myself that I choose to be with Martin Luther King and the values he stood for. During the time when I held intensive discussions with Carter and the turmoil in Southern Africa, I met a Catholic priest who had visited the US and who asked why we were ignoring one of the best and brilliant students he had ever heard. That's Mugabe. I decided that he was the very proper British schoolmaster, not the rebel-rousing freedom fighter I heard about. And indeed, you can tell how this is how Mugabe came across as well. This is not to sanitize his image, but you'll see some of the other comments here. He was stubborn, very sure of himself, and highly principled and committed. I learned to attribute this to his Jesuit Catholic upbringing. During that time, Young impressed on Carter that liberation movements were all about democracy and free enterprise, and this helped him attract the attention of Carter towards turmoil plaguing Southern Africa. So here he's using a bit of interest convergence to say, hey, free enterprise, you say? Even though some of these groups are definitely more socialist leaning. But for him to sell it to Carter, even though he's on the left of American politics, during the Cold War, it still had to be done. He still couldn't seem like he was leaning into anything that could take them down the communist route. One of Young's signature achievements was helping the Carter administration to develop policy guidelines that called for maintaining economic sanctions against Rhodesia, despite the election of Bishop Abel Muzorewa, a puppet prime minister of the short-lived Zimbabwe Rhodesia. I've explained that quite a bit in my video on the flags and my other videos on Zimbabwean history, so I'll include that in the description below. But in a nutshell, this is how it played out. In 1979, Young was playing a leading role in the advancing a settlement in Rhodesia with Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, who would be the vice president. The settlement paved the way for Mugabe to take power as prime minister of Zimbabwe. There had been a general election in 1979, bringing Bishop Abel Muzorewa, who we just mentioned, to power as leader of the United African National Council, leading to the short-lived country, Zimbabwe Rhodesia. Young refused to accept the election results and described the election as neo-fascist, a sentiment echoed by the UN Security Council resolution and others. The situation was resolved the next year with the Lancaster House Agreement, in 1980 and the establishment of Zimbabwe. Young's favoring of Mugabe and Nkomo over Muzorewa and his predecessor and ally Ian Smith had been controversial. Many African-American activists, including Jesse Jackson and Coretta Scott King, supported Mugabe and Nkomo. However, it was opposed by others, including civil rights leader Bayard Rustin, who argued that the 1979 election had been free and fair, as well as other senators. But that is, if for anybody who knows Zimbabwean history, even though hindsight is 2020 based on how people feel about Mugabe, there was no way the election that led to Muzorewa becoming the president, prime minister, was anything close to democratic. 80% of the country didn't even participate in that. Such a farce of an election. And indeed, Mugabe and Nkomo, the ZANU-ZAPU, those were the popular parties. So if the idea was to have a democratic thing, if you want to talk about something else, then we can talk about other things. But if you want to talk about what was the democratic, who were the people clamoring for, it was to be between ZAPU and ZANU. With all the complication and with all the hindsight that prevents, there is no logical reason why, it would be Muzorewa at this point. Indeed. So after independence, the U.S. rushed to establish relations with the new government, becoming the first country to officially open its embassy, right? Young presided over a ceremony in which the U.S. agreed to provide $2 million for rehabilitation of 160 provincial health centers as the first installment of $15 million of aid promised the fiscal year. Although Britain was chiefly responsible for the settlement that led to the creation of Zimbabwe Rhodesia, US officials also credited Andrew Young for playing an influential role that compelled Qatar to maintain US sanctions until there was an agreement to offer free and fair elections. So, we can see where this is going. When asked earlier, right, he explained that securing negotiations leading to the Lancaster House talks was a major milestone. What we had decided on Zimbabwe spread to West Africa, and this worked in South Africa, but bloodless transformation of power. So Young's significance is beyond just being the man in this moment, right? Talking about Mugabe himself, Ambassador Andrew Young described Robert Mugabe in an interview with the Times of London on May 22, 1978, when asked, "Does Mr. Mugabe strike you as a violent man?" He responded, "Not at all. He's a very gentleman. In fact, one of the ironies of the whole struggle is I can't imagine Joshua Nkomo or Robert Mugabe even pulling the trigger or a gun to kill anyone. I doubt they ever have. I think I'm just fascinated by his intelligence, by his dedication. The only thing that frustrates me about Robert Mugabe is how he is so damned incorruptible. The problem is he was educated by the Jesuits. And when you get the combination of Jesuit and Marxist kind of philosophy merging in one person, you've got one hell of a guy to deal with." I don't know, man. So this is where the lionization of individuals may come back to hurt us, right? What, just to say he's a Marxist and he's a Jesuit, he is also his own person. And power corrupts people. I don't know if Young in 2013 would still speak complimentary of Mugabe. I don't know what he would have said in 2020 about the reputation of Bob, as it were. Pitfalls of nationalism, when he writes about that in The Wretched of the Earth. Be on the lookout for folks, right? Because I don't know. Even if you say Mugabe wouldn't pull a trigger, can he order people to pull a trigger? Because the victims of Gukura Hundi, for example, would certainly, the masses who ended up, feeling the brunt of his gun, or the persecution of his men, I think they might speak differently on this. Indeed. But in any case, Young's sizable ego, tenacity, and willingness to push hard for diplomatic results won him both admiration and animosity. His succession on the Zimbabwean peace talks was a major turning point for U.S. diplomacy in foreign policy, something that the Britain under Thatcher was forced into admitting. So even Thatcher admitted that Young had done things. In 1981, he's gone back. Young was elected mayor of Atlanta, and he was re-elected in 1985, serving right through to 1990. Mr. Mugabe's visit to the U.S., his second since his election as prime minister in 1980, came amid sharpened concern in Washington and other Western capitals about Mugabe's domestic policy. So now we enter the 1980s, right? But Mr. Mugabe's stop in Atlanta came at the invitation of Young, right? And who described Mugabe even in the 1980s as a good friend and praised Zimbabwe as a friend of democracy in Africa. Mayor Young said he hoped the visit would underscore Atlanta's role as an international gateway and would help persuade Zimbabwe to open a tourist office there. Fascinatingly, if you go to the Atlanta airport to this day, Hartfield, you will see a Zimbabwean exhibit over there. I don't know if it's tied to Mayor Young or not, but this underscores that it's such a big exhibit. You can't miss it if you go to the airport there. Very fascinating. I'll be very interested. Let me know in the comments if you know what that's about, and maybe that's a different video for another day. But Young himself later would go on to say things like, Zimbabwe is the richest country maybe God ever put on earth. Everybody ought to eat steak if we do it right. He's saying this at the cusp of independence. I don't want to see it mess up or for us to look for a reason why it should fail. We should look for good things that can make this country to work and succeed. So he was very optimistic about. I'm sure, realistically, he would be disappointed with where it went, even if the faults fall on many fronts, right? Whether it's poor decisions by the government, by the ZANU PF government, the tyranny and the corruption thereof, but also the machinations of the neo-colonial machinations of the Western powers themselves. Right, starting with the land redistribution, with the land reform as was promised in the 1990s, and so forth. On the other hand, though, the other American we had here was Dom McHenry, who was a chief delegate to the UN under Carter. McHenry attended Illinois State University, graduated with a BS in 1957. He then continued to earn a master's degree from Southern Illinois University and began a doctoral program at Georgetown University. He did his research on South Africa, right, at the Brookings Institute or in New York. So now you have this sort of double team with the American. You have this career diplomat in the form of McHenry and a civil rights activist in the form of Young. And McHenry got active very early on in this capacity. If anything, there's a great interview with him and Zorewa and Como back in 1978 at the McNeil-Lehrer Report. His work particularly focused on Southwest Africa, right, or Namibia as it is called now, and which led him to him almost taking a backseat to Andrew Young in this conversation. Later on, when he had visited this place, and I remember reading this in the Christian Monitor Science, and this I'm quoting from that paper now, seeing some of the problems that he noticed right away in Zimbabwe. But what he's actually pointing to at the point in the 1980s, crazy how that tone would change, was more the fact that the US had not lived up to its promise to aid this country sort of transition into stability at the time in the 1980s. Later on, that would be out the window, and focus would be more on the political corruption in Zimbabwe. But at the time, browsing in a downtown store during a quick stop over in Zimbabwe, he was recognized by a shopkeeper, right, who pointedly asked, "Where's all that money from America?" A number of Zimbabweans, right, both white and black, ordinary citizens and government officials, are asking that question. The cliched maxim that Russians provide the arms in Africa, the Americans provide the aid, right? So Cold War politics in the early 80s here, making the US the more valued friend, is being sorely tested in this new African nation. Yeah. American diplomats here struggle to put the best face on American aid efforts. To its credit, the US has come across with more ready cash than the rest of the world's nations put together. But when other nations redeemed the old pledges, several will have contributed more in per capita terms than the US. The $20 million in American aid allocated for Zimbabwe this year, coupled with projected $30 million for the next US fiscal year, has therefore been a disappointment. Ambassador Henry, fresh from meeting with Prime Minister Robert Mugabe, acknowledged that there is a gap between expectations and performance of the American government in the reconstruction assistance after the bitter 7-year war there. That's the second Chimurenga. Many Zimbabweans see this aid question in much broader terms than the dollars and cents. Instead, they view the amount of American assistance as a rough indication of the degree of confidence in the new government here, and by extension, a judgment on the likely success of multiracial democracy prospering in this former British colony. Sensitive to this issue, American diplomats are hammering together an additional $15 million low-cost housing loan package. In addition, a new U.S. program allows other developing nations to use American grants to purchase Zimbabwe products. So it's just an interesting anecdote to see here, that because I think if that rhetoric happened right now or at any point after the 1980s, it would say like, "Oh, you guys are spoiled. Why should America pay anything or loan you anything?" But this is the nature of aid. This is also couched within Cold War terms, right? That a large part of the promise in the spirit of containment to sway countries like Zimbabwe away from Soviet influences was to a pseudo Marshall Plan, if you will, that would make sure that these countries did not provide a bastion for some last minute machinations by the Cold War rivals, the Soviet Union. Okay, so very interesting to see how it's almost as if the U.S. is at pains to look like the good guys at this time in ways that they wouldn't necessarily do much later, at least not within this space. So very fascinating here to see a little bit about McHenry's involvement. Mugabe traced the history of the negotiations and referred to the efforts of Andrew Young, Don McHenry, and Cyrus Vance to achieve a diplomatic solution. Those efforts, right, he's talking about the efforts that brought independence. Those efforts helped pave the way for the subsequent Lancaster House negotiations. He also expressed appreciation for the American financial and material support, especially in the area of refugees. This had given his people hope. This was from an August 1980 meeting with Carter, President Mugabe speaking about this. This is before McHenry would visit Zimbabwe and be pressed about. So a lot of goodwill at the time that would obviously soon evaporate. Then finally, I'm talking about an unmatched icon here, Robert Nesta, aka Bob Marley, born 6 February 1945. Jamaican singer, songwriter, musician, and considered to be one of the pioneers of reggae music. Definitely one of the people who took it international. Bob's contributions to music increased the visibility of Jamaican music worldwide, and he also went on to become a Pan-African icon and a Rastafari icon. Probably, even though he was brought to the faith through his wife Rita Marley, he's probably the most recognizable Rastafari figure in the world today. Bob Marley began his professional music career in 1963 after forming the group Bob Marley and the Wailers together with Barney Wailer and Peter Tosh. Then they got even more successful in the 1970s with Catch a Fire and Burning, which both came out in 1973. Now, the Wailers were scheduled to open 17 shows in the US for Sly and the Family Stone. After 4 shows, however, the band was fired because they were more popular than Sly and the Family Stone. So the Wailers were disbanded in 1974, with each of the 3 main members, Bob, Peter Tosh, and Barney Wailer, having distinguished solo careers. Right, but Marley kept moving. Natty Dread in 1974, Rastaman Vibration in 1976. A few months after the release of Rastaman's Vibration, Marley survived an assassination attempt at his home in Jamaica, which prompted him to permanently relocate to London. During his time in London, he recorded the album Exodus. Let's talk about his Pan-African credentials real quick. Marley was a Pan-Africanist and believed in the unity of African people worldwide. Babylon and Africa Unite. Marley specifically wrote Zimbabwe in support of the independence fighting rebels, which he debuted at the Amandla concert held in Boston, USA, to support the South African anti-apartheid struggle. Quoting here from a bit written by Robert Mukomba Choto and posted on the Zimbabwe Mbira Festival page back in 2018. And it reads like this. The real story regarding the coming of Bob Marley goes as follows. Mr. Edgar Tekere gave the letter inviting Bob Marley to come to Zim's independence to Job Kadengu and Gordon Muchanyuka and asked them to deliver the letter in person. When these two arrived at Mr. Marley's home in Kingston, Jamaica, a gentleman at the residence informed them that Mr. Marley was away playing soccer but would be back shortly. The 2 gentlemen volunteered to wait for Mr. Marley, whereupon they were given seats and waited. About an hour later, Mr. Marley returned home to see these emissaries awaiting him. After introducing themselves, they advised Mr. Marley that they had been sent with a letter from the Zimbabwean government and duly handed over the letter. Mr. Marley sat down and went through the letter in silence. After reading the letter, Mr. Marley rolled himself a spliff of his normal smoke. He took a few drags of it and passed it on to Gordon. Gordon, being an smoker of the stuff, wanted to decline the spliff and handed it back to where Job Kandengu told him in Shona take a drag, man. Otherwise, this guy will refuse to come to Zimbabwe. Peer pressure. That done, Gordon handed over the spliff to Job, who similarly took a drag and respectfully handed the spliff back to Bob Marley. But that done, Bob Marley said he was honored to be invited to perform at our Independence Day celebration. So that, I don't know if that story is apocryphal or not, but let's the reggae superstar not only accepted the invitation, but also spent tens of thousands of dollars to fly in his band and its equipment to take part in the festivities that started on the evening of April 17, 1980. UK-based musician, at this point I'm quoting from a different source. This is a source by... This is taken from a writing by Oluwalake on the publication Quartz. UK-based Pax Nindi, then a journalist with Zimbabwe's history national newspaper, The Herald, met Marley on the day before the concert and described him as a very humble man, simple in demeanor. When the band was rehearsing in the stadium early that day, Nindi recalls the noise of the PA system being unlike anything they had ever heard in the ghetto of Mbare, which neighbored the stadium. And this was the first inkling many had that Marley was in town. So people didn't even really know this. It was indeed ironic that Marley had been invited, as there had been a lot of contempt of Rastas by the local politicians at the time. Mugabe himself complained that Marley was too scruffy and suggested that the perennially wholesome Cliff Richard would be a better act. Think about that. Mugabe, this vaunted Pan-Africanist Bob, had such a low opinion of the other vaunted Bob Pan-Africanist that he wanted to bring Cliff Richards to be the act. But anyway, Tekere and them insisted on this. On the night, Bob's performance slot was immediately after the official flag raising. Indeed, some of the first official words in the new nation of Zimbabwe were, "Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Marley and the Wailers." Marley recognized the Independence Day concert had not been accessible to the masses, and typically, as he would have done, he therefore played a subsequent show the next day to an audience for over 100,000, almost exclusively black people, after the festivities. At his own expense, by the way. He wasn't paid. What money did the Zimbabwean government have, right? In 1977, Marley was diagnosed with acrolentigenous melanoma, and he died as a result of this illness in 1981. His greatest hits album, Legend, was released in 1984. In fact, I think he refused to receive treatment until much later on, and by the time he got that, it was too late, and that's why that's what's led to the conspiracy theories about him having been done in. But also interestingly, that again, like Walter Rodney, who died in Guyana, he was for the most part persona non grata in Jamaica at the time that he died, and his reputation has been redeemed long afterwards, long into his passing. The greatest hits album, Legend, was released in 1984 and became the best-selling reggae album of all time. Marley also ranks as one of the best-selling music artists of all time, with estimated sales of more than 75 million records worldwide. He was posthumously honored by Jamaica soon after his death with a designated Order of Merit by his nation. In 1994, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Rolling Stone ranked him the number 11 on its list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. All which are cool and just show how popular he was across the board. But importantly, here's a man who, together again with Walter Rodney, within a year of Zimbabwe's independence, they were both dead. Right, and in under different circumstances or so forth. But these are goals that they had for the Pan African community, and they lived long enough to see that goal achieved. And as to what it all means for their legacy, I will end here with the bit from the article I was reading earlier, the Olu Alake piece about how Bob might reflect on this. 40 years on from that iconic concert, it is difficult to know what he would have made of the show in the light of Zimbabwe's later struggles. Subsequent events have demonstrated the older generation of Zimbabweans have auto-mythologized the event. The internationally acclaimed Zimbabwean actor Lucien Msamati described this as a misdirected nostalgia at odds with the current reality that somehow still has a grip on core policy and culture and is choking and stunting it. So what they mean by that is, as different people claim to have played a bigger role in getting Bob there, right? Despite the fact that he funded his own way there, despite the fact that there was so much disdain from Mugabe initially, who now many people posit not so much as this Anglophile, but just as an unabashed Pan-Africanist from the beginning. These are some of the things that we have to consider as we go forward. Zimbabwe is 46 years old, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to stop the video